Chapter 9. Let's get this over with. I'm not going back to Jonesboro. Catty lifted her chin and pointed her finger in his chest, despite the pounding of her heart. She wasn't going to let some stranger roll into town and start dictating to her, no matter how big he was. What are you talking about? His brows drew together and he scratched his unshaven cheek. I know my parents sent you to find me. The desperate words seemed to echo and bounce off the shrubbery as she fought and failed to keep her voice confident. You can forget it. I'm not going back. Your family didn't send me. His tone, slow and deliberate, landed like a punch to her chest. Her heart felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, and any moment she expected it would break out of her chest and land on the grass with a thud. They didn't. She cleared her throat and mentally shook herself. What had she been thinking? Why would they want her back if they knew what she was? She could feel the heat rising in her face but forced herself to maintain eye contact. No, they didn't send me. He looked around and then narrowed his eyes at her. Then what do you want from me? He might be hot as hell, but she knew better than to trust a handsome face. He was up to something. I need some information. There is something going on with the Arkansas Guardians. Some are missing. So, she snorted. Maybe they got tired of doing what they were told and decided to leave. She understood all too well the desire to follow her own rules and not live under the command of anyone else. Catty, don't play with me. A girl like you working in a strip club that has more werewolves than humans has bound to have heard or seen something. He leaned in closer. His anger, his frustration, and his scent snaked around her like a vine. He was pissed, really pissed, but she couldn't help herself. Without thinking, she leaned in slightly to get a better sniff. What are you doing? She took a quick step back and shook her head. Sniffing you up didn't seem to sound right in her head, so she decided to shift the focus. Look, I have no idea what you're talking about. I've not heard anything about any guardians. I'm not the kind of girl a guardian would hang with. She smirked. You must have gotten some bad intel. I don't get bad intel. His eyes blazed. Her heart went into overdrive and a bead of sweat rolled down her temple only to be swallowed up by her t-shirt. Freaking Louisiana heat. She probably resembled a drowned rat. Look, buddy. She pushed her finger into his chest. He didn't budge. I don't know anything about missing guardians. Louisiana isn't exactly swimming with guardians since Edward Boudier has been running the state. Edward Boudier? The packmaster. He blinked. One and the same. She shrugged. He seems to think the state is fine without guardians and has been firing them right and left. Maybe that's what your pack master is doing too. Lucien knew Edward Boudier had been an asshole to Barrett ever since the Louisiana assassins had crossed into Arkansas without letting Barrett know. The whole thing was bad business to start with. Lucien had been surprised Barrett hadn't come down harder on Boudier. But now with Jaime skinned and Mitchell missing, the Louisiana packmaster would take a harder stance on illegal activity within the state. He would want more guardians. Unless Barrett hadn't told Edward about the missing guardians. You're telling me civilian werewolves are okay with everything like it stands with having fewer guardians? His eyes bore into hers. She'd better be honest with him. He wasn't here to play games. Civilians don't get a say. She cocked her head and crossed her arms. The wind changed. Her scent, soft, sultry, sexy, washed over him. His mind blurred and he couldn't control his body as his gaze dropped to her full mouth. His dick tightened behind his jeans. In that moment time slowed and noise ceased. From the curve of her lips to the glint in her eye, he was trapped in the spell of her scent, unable to focus on anything but her. What did her body taste like? What did she sound like when she came? What did she look like in the afterglow of an orgasm? Shocked, he stepped back and sucked in a deep breath, dislodging the surprising erotic thoughts that had come out of nowhere. Women didn't affect him. Not like she had. When he was horny, he paid for ass. It was a lot less complicated, and the women never asked why he kept his jacket on during sex. Many thought it was a turn-on. As he stared down into Catty's blue-gray eyes, his heart thudded in his chest. He glanced up at the approaching sunrise and blamed his reaction on the heat of the city. Surely it had nothing to do with her. Everyone has a say. It's the duty of the packmaster of every state to protect its wares. A shadow of sadness crossed her eyes before a mask of indifference slipped carefully into place. A hardness etched into her pretty features, and he knew. She wasn't going to give him any more information today. I guess I won't take up any more of your time. He stepped back and propped his hands on his hips. Her lashes fluttered for a second. She held her breath as if he were waiting to trick her. He wasn't. It wasn't his style. Good. I've got things to do. She lifted her chin and turned on her heel. He watched the sway of her hips as she walked away. Even in cut-off denim, shorts and a baggy shirt, the girl had a body that had the early morning male crowd stopping what they were doing and turning to watch her. A nearby artist stopped setting up his artwork and watched Catty with lustful eyes. Lucien let out a growl before he could remember himself. The man caught the look in Lucien's face. His smile faded and he quickly got back to work. He watched until she turned the corner. He would give her a few seconds before following. He knew how to tail someone without getting made. Keeping to the shadows was how he'd survived the city before. It was how he planned on surviving it again. With her heart in her throat, Catty made it halfway down the alley before she glanced over her shoulder. She fully expected the large wolf to be following her. The empty alley sent a smidge of disappointment settling across her gut. She shook her head. No, she wasn't going to be disappointed. She was relieved. Fisting her hands at her side, she continued walking. The soft tap of the rubber of her tennis shoes against the pavers echoed quietly between the two buildings. The rising sun and the shadows of the alley did nothing to shield her from the heat of the day. The humidity would reach its fingers through every nook and cranny of the Crescent City and not leave any living thing untouched. She plucked her sweaty shirt away from her stomach and cursed the heat. Reaching into her back pocket, she fished out a ponytail holder. She secured her sweaty hair with the tiny scrap of elastic. A heated breeze skimmed the back of her naked neck and a loose drop of sweat rolled down from her hair. She swiped her hand across her forehead and glanced both ways down the street. After a car rolled past, she hurried across and then took another left toward the rundown part of town. This wasn't a part of town she would ever brave alone at night, but right now, with the sun coming up over the horizon, she felt safe enough to travel and not worry about getting mugged. This was a high-crime area, especially after dark. Though drug houses were abundant in the neighborhood, so were the elderly people. Those were the people who'd lived there all their lives and couldn't afford to move out. Their neighborhood had been taken over by the drug dealers, and the elderly were stuck. She stopped when she came to Mrs. Willis's house. The shotgun-style house, painted a vivid yellow many years ago, had seen better days. After weathering storms like Hurricane Katrina, the house was more the color of a coffee-stained tablecloth than a bright friendly yellow, appealing white picket fence. And the small gate hanging off-center were more evidence of how the house had fallen into disrepair. Every now and then, Catty would squeeze her eyes and imagine the house in its glory days when it looked like a picturesque portrait of the typical American dream. It was a blessing in disguise that Mrs. Willis had gone blind a few years ago from glaucoma. She would hate to know what her house looked like now. She shoved open the damaged gate and walked down the uneven brick walk to the front door. The porch was small and empty with an old white rocking chair. In the spring, Catty had come by and hung some purple petunias from the porch. Mrs. Willis had commented on the smell and assured Catty they must be pretty. To some, it might seem like a waste of money since Mrs. Willis would never see the flowers, but it was worth it to see the old woman smile. She rapped briskly on the wooden door. Mrs. Willis, it's Catty. She glanced over at the neighbor's unkempt yard. The grass was in desperate need of mowing and the bushes against the house looked like they hadn't been trimmed in over a year. An old Lincoln sedan sat in the yard with its naked wheels up on cinder blocks. The other houses on the street were not much better. Mrs. Willis would cringe if she could see the forsaken state the neighborhood had fallen into. She tried to get Mrs. Willis to move, but the old lady was stubborn. She said it had been her home for 80 years and she wasn't about to move. She said the way she was going to leave her home was in a pine box. The door creaked open, revealing Mrs. Willis dressed in a simple yellow cotton dress and a gray apron. Catty dear. The excitement in Mrs. Willis's voice touched something deep inside her and made her homesick. I didn't expect you today. Come in, come in. It's my day off and I thought I would come for a visit. She gave the woman a hug, inhaling the comforting scent of drugstore perfume. I'm glad you came. I'm not sure if I have any cookies for tea, but you're welcome to look. Mrs. Willis placed her hand at the base of her throat and frowned. Being brought up in the South, she thrived on being a good hostess, even after her eyesight failed her. I ate some beignet and I couldn't possibly eat another thing, she declined, politely as she stepped inside. The high ceiling fan stirred up enough breeze, sending a welcome relief from the heat. She glanced around, noticing the dust on the end table beside the couch. I hope I didn't disturb you. I didn't mean to drop in on you like this. But I needed someplace safe away from Lucien's probing eyes. The way he looked at her had her feeling a certain way about the male. She didn't want to put a name to the emotion. He might be hot, but he was dangerous. And she was done with dangerous werewolves. She wanted someone safe. Right now a relationship would have to wait. Her love life was officially on the back burner. You know I always love to see you, dear. Mrs. Willis tapped the floor with her cane as she shuffled into the living room. Shelley came and cleaned yesterday. It wasn't her normal day, but she said she needed some extra money for school clothes, so I let her. Catty gritted her teeth. Shelley was Mrs. Willis's granddaughter. She'd met her few times. She'd come over once while Catty was visiting and asked her grandmother for money. With dark hair and blue eyes, Shelley was attractive and knew how to dress to accentuate her body. She didn't have any tattoos or piercings and seemed nice enough. But there was something about the girl Catty didn't trust. When she found out Shelley was cleaning Mrs. Willis's house for money, she'd made a point of checking out the furniture and floors when she came over. While the floors had been swept and stuff picked up, it was evident no deep cleaning had been done. Nothing had been dusted, the toilets hadn't been cleaned, and the rugs had not been vacuumed. She didn't want to worry Mrs. Willis with her suspicions of a lazy girl, so she kept her mouth shut. Is she still liking school? She tried to keep her tone casual as Mrs. Willis shuffled over in the direction of her rocking chair. Catty gently laid her hand on the woman's arm to escort her. She's doing fine. She says her classes are going well. Mrs. Willis eased into the rocker that had been in her family for generations, and although it squeaked like a mouse, she said she loved it and had no reason to get another. You're up mighty early. Did you have to work last night? Mrs. Willis asked. Catty worried her lip with her teeth at the mention of her job. She'd lied to Mrs. Willis when she'd asked what she did for a living. She knew what the woman's reaction would have been if she found out she was a stripper. So, instead she'd told her she worked at a convenience store. I do worry about you working so late at night. Crime gets bad in the city at night when people think God ain't watching. But believe me, God is always watching. Catty's stomach twisted. That was what she was afraid of. I was in the neighborhood and thought I would pop in and see if you needed me to do anything for you. How sweet of you. You know, Shelley can run errands for me, but lately she's been in a hurry when she drops by. There's no time for a proper visit. She shook her head and rested her cane against her knee. I'm sure she's just busy. Busy with what? She wasn't real sure. How about I fix you a cup of tea? Catty stood before she could be waved off. You're so sweet, dear. Thank you. She walked into the kitchen and frowned when she saw the state of the cabinets. They were all open and the dishes inside disturbed. Not the way Mrs. Willis usually liked her tidy kitchen. She quickly filled the kettle with water and placed it on the stove. She turned on the heat and then turned her attention back to the cabinets. She went to the first one and straightened the dishes as quietly as possible. Are you finding everything okay, Catty? Yes, ma'am. Getting your pretty china, she lied. After straightening the set of plates, she closed the cabinet and moved to the next one. Immediately she spied the blue and white china pattern. The intricate pattern was no knockoff, and she knew the set must have been in Mrs. Willis's family for years. It had to be valuable. Catty was always worried someone would break in and steal it and hurt Mrs. Willis in the process. The kettle whistled as she finished setting the cabinets to rights. She set 2 cups and saucers on the counter and found the tea canister and pulled out 2 tea bags. She poured the hot water over the bags and watched as the water turned light brown. She opened the cabinet to pull out the silver tray. It wasn't there. Maybe it had gotten moved when Shelley cleaned. She found a wooden tray instead and set the cups down. She grabbed some lemon cookies she found in the pantry and placed them on the tray as well. Here we go. Catty smiled as she set the tray down on the coffee table. She passed a cup and saucer to Mrs. Willis before taking her seat on the couch and placing her saucer and teacup on her lap. Ah, cookies too. You're such a dear, Catty. Your mother must be so proud to have such a lady like you. She flinched. Her mother would be anything but proud. So tell me what really brings you here today. Mrs. Willis took a sip of her tea as a smile settled around her wrinkled lips. I may not see so well, but I know when a girl is having some man problems. You, my dear girl, are having some man problems. Wanna tell me his name? Chapter 10. Son of a bitch. Barrett threw the package across the room and curled his fingers into tightly coiled fists. His heart pounded as rage swelled in his gut. He knew without opening it what the box held. The coppery scent of blood permeated the room and sent anger raging through his veins. His gaze searched the room before landing on the stained piece of paper sitting on his desk. It had been taped to the outside of the package that had fuck off look. The delivery man had been human and he had no idea of the horrific contents the box held. He glanced down at the barely legible scrawl. Your wolves will pay for your arrogance, Barrett. Make no mistake about that. I will skin each guardian until there are none left. The inside of the box held a hand. He could only guess it was Jaime's. His mind raced as he tried to think who would be behind such a horrendous act. He knew as Packmaster he certainly pissed off a lot of worse, but there was nothing that demanded this type of retribution. A heavy knock landed on the door. Before he could tell whoever it was to go to hell, the door swung open and Jackson stepped through. Jackson must have caught the look on Barrett's face because he stopped short. His brows knit together and his nostrils flared as he caught the faint scent of blood. Did someone die in here? Not yet, Barrett snarled. Jackson held up his hands and his eyes narrowed. Does this have anything to do with Lucien? Maybe. If he needs help, then send me. Jackson lifted his chin as if preparing for Barrett's wrath. He doesn't need help. He's fine on his own. Barrett turned back to the pack master seal that covered the wall. Serve and protect. That was what the Guardians did. They laid down their life for their civilian wares. So who was going to lay down their life for the Guardians? The whole thing made him mad as hell. I know you sent him on a mission and he wouldn't say shit to me about where he was going. But if he's in trouble, then tell me so I can help him. Barrett rounded on the younger were and snatched him up by the collar of his t-shirt. Hauling him off the ground, he held him at eye level. Don't try to tell me how to do my job, Jackson. You forget your place. Adrenaline cascaded through his body. His muscles twitched, aching to punch something until it bled. Easy, man, Jackson said calmly. He had to hand it to Jackson. He didn't try to act like a pussy when he was in his crosshairs. Nor did he beg. Barrett blinked, released his grip and stepped back. His gut twisted with regret. He'd never laid a hand on any of his guardians ever. My bad, boss. Jackson nodded his head but didn't back up. I shouldn't have overstepped my boundaries. He ran his hand through his hair. It's not that I don't trust you. I'm worried about Lucien. I know. Barrett's hardened gaze landed on the package. He was worried about his guardian too. But Jackson didn't need to know that. I'll let you know when I need you, Jackson. Jackson nodded and looked as if he was about to say something else and then thought better of it. Without another word, the were slipped out the door. Barrett had to handle this correctly, had to keep things quiet. He wasn't going to let one more of his men get hurt because he'd managed to piss off some psycho. His gut told him there were no easy decisions in this matter. He was betting everything on Lucien. If Lucien came up with nothing, then they were all as good as dead. Lucien waited in the obscure shadows of a ramshackle house. He couldn't imagine why Catty would be in this part of town unless she was up to something. Maybe she had a drug habit he hadn't picked up on. His brows knit together as he recalled both their meetings. He shook his head. She wasn't on drugs. She didn't have the usual signs of being a druggie, nor did he smell it on her. Her scent. He closed his eyes and inhaled a breath. She smelled hot and sweet like a breeze coming off the ocean in the middle of a scorching summer. Her scent was as unique as her sassy mouth. Who would have thought she'd be as strong-willed as Zane? He let out a little chuckle as he tried to image what life had been like for her growing up, and what had happened to make her end up here. He'd seen the fear in her eyes when she thought her parents had sent him to find her, and the flash of disappointment that had followed when he said her Parents hadn't sent him. Catty had a wall up. A boundary she kept up between her and the men she danced for. He'd seen it at the club, how she'd placed her mask of sexuality on, and he'd seen it when it slipped. She didn't belong there in the bowels of hell. He caught a whiff of marijuana. He jerked his head in the direction of the smoke, and his gaze met a pockmarked-faced druggie. You looking to party? The guy nodded at his joint before glancing nervously over his shoulder. Lucien doubted the cops would even dare venture into this crack-infested neighborhood. No, he growled and looked back at the house. I got some harder stuff if you want, man. The guy shoved his hand into his baggy jeans pocket and pulled out a bag of crack. His hand shook as he held it out. Take a hint and fuck off. He bowed up and took a step toward the guy. The guy's eyes widened and he got the message. He shoved his bag of drugs back in his pocket and took off at a run down the street. Fucking asshole. Lucien kept his gaze locked on the guy until he disappeared down the alley. What did you expect in this neighborhood? Catty asked. I could ask you the same question. You don't strike me as the druggy type. He turned and faced Catty. She'd managed to sneak up on him. Not good. Not good at all. I'm not. She glared and crossed her arms over her amazing chest. And you already knew. Don't lie. I know you can't smell drugs on me. Why are you hanging around this neighborhood? Don't you know what guys like? That do to girls who look like you. He nearly growled the words as another tweaker walked by and openly eyed Catty. I'm here checking on a friend. She narrowed her pretty gaze and he thought. For a second flames would spark out of her eyes. He stepped closer. Oh yeah? Who is this friend? He fisted his hands at his sides to keep from grabbing her by the arms. Her insolence grated on him in ways he couldn't describe. He was here for a reason, a mission. And he sure as hell didn't have time for her frivolous games. Well, if you must know, she smiled. My friend's name is Go Fuck Yourself. She gave him the bird, turned on her heel, and marched down the sidewalk. The blood pounded between his ears like an ocean wave matching the beat of his heart. Who the hell did she think she was talking to? Shoving off the side of the house, he went after her. Grabbing her elbow with his hand, he spun her around. No wonder your family hasn't come looking for you. Her confidence slid off her face, and for a moment he saw a hurt little girl. His stomach lurched and twisted. It was a dick thing to say. He shouldn't have even gone there. He'd wanted to hurt her to see a real reaction, but even he hadn't wanted that reaction. He released his hold and softened his voice. Look, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said it. He ran his hand through his hair. She shrugged and adjusted the mask of indifference she wore so well. Even if you didn't say it, you would still be thinking it. So it's the same. You think, because I'm a stripper I must be a whore and use drugs. To you I'm a nobody. Nobody who has no family. That's not fair. And it's not what He studied the tip of his boot and shoved his hands in his pockets. His chest ached and he shifted his weight. Stop. She held up her hand. Just stop. It doesn't matter. She glanced at the house she'd been visiting and nodded. If you want to know what I was doing here, then look for yourself. He looked up and the front door opened. A petite elderly woman stepped out onto the porch. She had large dark sunglasses and a cane. Lucien knew immediately the woman was blind. Is she a relative? He really felt like a dick. He was no better than his brother. Instead of violence, Lucien hurt with his words. Her face softened. No, just someone who was kind to me when I first moved here. I met her in the grocery store one day. Her caretaker was high and trying to steal her money at the cash register and I caught her. Since then, I've looked after her. She doesn't get many visitors, so I go check on her. She shrugged. You help her? He squeezed his eyes shut and scrubbed his hand down his face. Yeah, well, maybe I do it to even out my karma. She smirked and walked away. You know, to cancel out my sins. He forced his feet to move and caught up with her. I'm sorry. I didn't mean what I said earlier. I don't know you, so I can't judge you. She said nothing. She was going to make this hard on him. If he wanted information, he was going to have to eat crow. He sucked in a deep breath and blew it out. My karma isn't looking positive right now. What do you suggest? He met her gaze. The corners of her lips twitched, threatening to break out into a smile. Perhaps keeping your nose out of my business. That would be a great start. I wish I could. He couldn't. He needed to find the missing guardians and then find his brother. Catty, there are things I've been sent here to find out. I think you might know something about what I'm looking for. She stopped and stepped into his space. There it was again. The hot tingling sensation that arced between them even though they were not touching. It was hot enough without having her standing so close, but good God, she seemed to make their space explode like a volcano. She cocked her head and stared up at him, a hardness to her eyes. Honey, I'm sure there are a lot of females who would do anything you want. But I really don't know what you're talking about. Maybe that's why I'm still alive. I try to stay invisible. She shook her head and stepped back. Sorry. I'm not your girl. I think you are. He dug out his wallet and pulled out some money. If you want me to tell you a lie so you can pay me some money, then go right ahead. She pressed her full lips into a line of thinly veiled rage. For what? Look, I told you I don't have any information. Her eyes narrowed. How much for a night? Her eyes widened as her mouth dropped. Clamping down her mouth, she curled her hands into fists at her side. Look, asshole, I'm not a whore. I didn't say you were. He looked around as a couple of guys passing by eyed Catty with interest. And you need to keep your voice down, he hissed. A guy stopped in front of them and nodded at Catty. If you ain't gonna take her, I will. He reached in his pocket and pulled out a $20 bill. How much for a blow job, sweetheart? Liquid anger filled Lucien's vision as the guy grabbed Catty's arm. He swung at the guy, landing a hard blow to his face and knocking him on the ground. Don't you fucking touch her. He snatched the guy off the ground by the collar of his stained t-shirt. The man's eyes rolled back in his head and his head lolled to the side. Lucien punched him in the face again for good measure. Lucien, behind you. Catty screamed. He let go of the guy, who crumpled to the ground. Pain ripped through his shoulder. He spun around. A guy held up a knife covered in his blood. The guy had cut Lucien's arm. Adrenaline pumped through his cells and spilled over. Rage replaced pain. Revenge replaced control. He looked up from the wound in his arm and met the guy's gaze and smiled. Jesus, man. What kind of shit are you on not to feel that? The guy backed up and stumbled over his own feet as he tried to get away. Lucien, we need to go. Catty tugged on his arm. He dragged his gaze from the asshole who'd stabbed him to the one lying on the ground. They were quickly drawing a crowd as thugs came out of the houses like cockroaches. We need to go, Catty stated. He glanced around. He might be a werewolf, but there were 30 humans who were either drunk or high, and they were all carrying guns. Even if he could take them, there was a high chance of Catty getting hurt. He couldn't chance. He needed to get her out of here. Come on. He grabbed her hand and hurried down the nearest alley. Chapter 11. Lucien. Catty snatched her hand out of his and stopped. What? He turned and glared. Your t-shirt and jacket are soaked with blood. She reached out and touched his back. She held up her blood-stained fingers. You can't tell it's blood on your jacket, but you are leaving a blood trail with every step you take. He sucked in a hissing breath as the burning pain began to register in his cells. Someone will call the cops when they see all this blood. We need to get this bandaged up. Now. She met his gaze. He looked up the street toward his hotel. My hotel is 5 blocks from here. She shook her head. No, it's too far. My place is closer. Sighing, she grabbed his hand. Come on this way. She made a left and kept to the inside of the sidewalk. People were beginning to stir, and he did notice some stares. From some people they passed, but they didn't say a word. By the time they made it to her apartment, his shoulder was pounding like a bitch. He couldn't tell if the wetness on his shirt was blood or sweat, but he guessed it was a little of both. She hurried through the front door of the building. The outside didn't seem like much, old brick with vines growing along the side. Once he stepped inside the darkened foyer, the decor didn't get much better. The stairs will be quicker. He didn't argue. They stepped out onto the 3rd floor. The dated wallpaper and dim lighting illuminated the dark, dingy floors. A long time ago the complex was probably stylish and beautiful, but time and lack of upkeep had eaten away at her beauty and dulled her shine. The building was sitting on the edge of the dangerous part of the city, and unless the city council decided to rejuvenate this part of town, it was going to continue to decline into disrepair. She dug in her pocket for her key and unlocked the door. She motioned him inside with her hand. He stepped in and was surrounded by the soft scent of jasmine. His gaze swept the small space and landed on the candles sitting on the bedside table. The wooden floors creaked under his feet as he walked farther into the small space. It was a loft-style living area with a bed in the middle of the area, where a living room should have been. Sit down and let me look at your shoulder. She nodded toward her bed. It's fine. Give me some bandages and I'll do it myself. No way was he letting her touch him. She'd probably cut his throat first chance she got. Are you always this rude? I'm not rude. He was honest. There was a big difference. Sit. She nodded to the bed. He reluctantly complied. The mattress squeaked under his weight. The ache in arm matched the pain in his shoulder. He glanced across the studio, taking in her place. It was a studio apartment, with wood floors and brick walls. The bedroom and living room were in the same space, and off to the right was a small kitchen separated by a curtain. A door off the living room led into a small bathroom. There were splashes of her personality scattered around the room, which made the small dark space feel less cramped. A small writing table, which doubled as a makeup table, sat alongside the wall. Scattered tubes of lipstick and eyeshadow were strewn across it along with a laptop computer. Her bed had no headboard but was decorated with a ton of pillows in every shade of pink. The comforter matched the pillows. He noticed a silky tank top and matching bottoms near his boot. Ignoring the searing pain in his shoulder, he bent and picked up the pink material. He inhaled. She'd slept in this last night. Her scent was all over it. He slammed his eyes shut as his body stirred with lust and hardened to a point of pain. His hand clutched the bed covering as he fought to get images of Catty's scantily clad body out of his mind. Here, take this. His eyes popped open. She shoved a glass half full of amber-colored liquid into his hand. A sharp whiff told him it was Jack Daniels. He hated Jack Daniels. It will help with the pain. She gave him a hard look. The adrenaline was leaving his body, and the pain was increasing with every breath. He tossed the glass back and down the whiskey. He grimaced as the liquid slid down his throat, burning all the way. Not a fan of whiskey? I prefer beer. I don't like it either, she admitted. One of my girlfriends left it here the last time she came over. Some guy gave it to her at the club. She knelt on the bed and set her bandaging supplies beside her. Take your jacket off. He eyed her for a moment and then reluctantly slid the leather jacket off his shoulders and laid the leather across his lap. This cut isn't so deep. She wrapped the white gauze around the wound on his arm and taped it down. When she was done, she grabbed the hem of his shirt. He wrapped his fingers around her wrist. The shirt stays on. But how can I stop the bleeding on your shoulder with your shirt still on? Here. He ripped the sleeve of his t-shirt and shoved it up over his bicep. She shook her head but didn't say anything. Perhaps she'd thought better of trying to argue with him. This one's deeper. If you were human, you would need sticks. Good thing I'm a werewolf then. Yeah, good thing, she murmured. Her hair brushed the top of his bicep as she worked. His body warmed and tightened. Her scent was all around him, trapping him with invisible fingers, trapping him and refusing to let him go. So is your friend a stripper too? He nodded toward the bottle of whiskey. She is. You got a problem with strippers. She held the bandage over his wound and craned her neck over his shoulder to meet his eyes. Her scent and the heat from her body felt like lightning from a summer storm. He sucked in a breath, and he could swear he could taste her on his lips. No, I don't. He gritted his teeth. She was way too close for his liking. You take things the wrong way. Her mouth parted and it took all his strength not to move those final 3 inches closer and press his lips against hers. When he forced his gaze up to her eyes, he realized she'd caught him looking at her mouth. Don't even think about it. She glared. Think about what? He swallowed. Don't think about kissing me. She shot him a look like she could kill. Kissing you is the last thing I need to be doing. He reacted on instinct before his mind could process what he was doing. He cupped his hand around the back of her neck and closed the distance between them. His mouth covered hers, hard and unflinching. He swept his tongue inside her mouth, tasting her spicy sweetness. He growled as he deepened the kiss. He wanted to taste her fully so he could get her out of his mind once and for all. She pressed her hand against his chest and broke the kiss. Apparently you don't listen, she said breathlessly. I said don't kiss. Me. She shoved away and walked into the kitchen. What had he done? Body on fire and trembling with lust, he stood and made his way to the window. He needed to look at anything but her. He wished he regretted what he'd done, but he didn't. He wished he had gotten her out of his system. He hadn't. He wished he didn't want to kiss her again, but he did. He braced his arm above the window and studied the floor. He'd lost control. A vision of his brother echoed in his head, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. If he didn't gain control over his actions, he was going to slip into that same fucking abyss and become what he detested the most. His brother. He was nothing like his brother. He took a deep breath, held it, and counted to 10 before he blew it out. He glanced at the traffic below as cars and motorcycles moving at a snail's pace down the street, unhurried with no one to see and nothing to do. It was the vibe he got from New Orleans. Unlike him, he, on the other hand, had places to go and people to find. He had a mission, and it sure as fuck didn't include trying to get Zane's sister into bed. Fuck me. He cradled the wound in his shoulder as the pain returned full force. As a werewolf, he would heal soon enough. It didn't ache any worse than the ache behind his zipper. I think we established I wasn't interested. Her voice trickled over him and he turned. Gone was the anger he'd seen in her eyes. In its place was the stalwart, confident barrier she seemed to carry with her like heavy armor. I apologize. I shouldn't have kissed you. He forced the words out despite the urge to take her into his arms and kiss her again. She narrowed her eyes and cocked her head. I almost believe you. His head snapped up. I always respect women. I've never forced a woman to do something she didn't want to do. I'm not that guy. I said, I almost believe you. Why did you think you could take what's not yours? She walked toward him until they were toe to toe and far, far too close. His body raged with lust as her scent became overwhelming. He took a step back. To regain his composure, she took a step forward. He angled his body away from the window so his back wouldn't hit the wall, and when she took another step into his personal space, the backs of his legs hit the bed. Smirking, she stepped closer and shoved his chest. He had no choice but to sit. As his body landed on the bed, he felt his resolve slipping. Tell me something, Lucien. She straddled his legs and sat on his lap. Tell me what makes a male think they have the right to a woman's body. Her sweet ass pressed into his jean-clad legs. His dick hardened and throbbed. He fisted his hands in the comforter to keep from touching her. They don't. A male worth anything respects a woman. She scooted closer until her sweet spot was resting right over his erection. He gritted his teeth and growled. She smirked and pressed her hands to his chest, knocking him back onto the bed. With her advantage over him, she hovered over his stomach and leaned down. Her warm breath hit his cheek as she leaned to his ear. Is it because some males think just because some girls take their clothes off for a living they are whores? Anger flashed behind her eyes. No. She ran her finger down his chest. When she reached the top of his jeans, she dipped her finger inside, touching the flesh of his stomach. If that's true, then why are you hard? She smirked. Getting hard over a beautiful woman is a natural reaction. You think I'm beautiful? She held his gaze. You know you are. The hated words grated his throat as sweat popped out over his skin. And if I were to do this, would you still stop if I said no? She leaned back and reached for the bottom of her shirt. Slowly, ever so fucking slowly, she lifted it over her head, revealing a black bra and a smooth expanse of flat stomach. He tried to swallow, but his mouth was like sandpaper. Catty, you are messing with fire. No, Lucien, you are. Her smirk changed into something hard. I've known men like you. Males who think just because a girl takes her clothes off for money, that it includes sex too. That we are asking for it. There was a hard edge to her voice, hard enough to cut through steel. I never said that. The blood pulsed in his ears. But back there you offered me money. I offered you money for your time, not sex. So if I took this off, she ran her fingertip under the strap of her bra. You wouldn't take it as a sign I want you to fuck me. Catty, stop it, Lucien warned. Why? Unable to control your urges around a naked woman, Lucien. She smirked and reached around her back to unhook her bra. He grabbed her hand. Cut it out, Catty. Why? Isn't this what you want? She leaned down and playfully nipped his ear. He grabbed her waist and twisted his body, putting hers underneath his. Fear flitted through her eyes before she fixed her face into the same confident cold mask she usually wore. I don't hurt women. You don't fucking know me, so stop lumping me in with every other asshole who's ever hurt you. You are the one who started this bullshit about me thinking you were a whore because you are a stripper. As frankly none of my business, to be quite honest. Stop being a brat and grow the fuck up. He scrambled off the bed, grabbed his jacket off the floor and headed for the front door. Lucien, wait. Why? He didn't turn to look at her. Her assumptions about him had him more pissed off than turned on. He heard the soft falling of clothes over her body. When he turned, she was dressed and standing behind him with her hands in her jeans pockets. Her cheeks were stained red and she studied the floor. I'm sorry I offended you. She lifted her eyes to him. He said nothing. The uncomfortable weight in his chest made him look away. I'm not here for fun. I'm here to try to help your brother. And your games aren't helping anything. He turned and grabbed the doorknob. Lucien, wait. Is Zane in trouble? She grabbed his arm. The Guardians are all in trouble. She blinked and paled a bit. So he's a Guardian now. Yeah, why? Do you have something against Guardians? He fired back. No, of course not. I didn't know. That's all. She swallowed before she spoke. You can't go yet. I haven't bandaged your shoulder. I'm fine. The bleeding stopped. He opened the door and made his exit. He stepped out onto the street, the heat of the day bearing down on him like a wet quilt. He glanced down at his arm. His body was already showing signs of healing. He caught the wide-eyed stares from passers-by who openly stared at his bloodied shirt. He shot them a glare and they quickly averted their eyes to the ground and hastened their steps. He needed to get away from her to calm down, to think. Whatever had happened between them couldn't happen again. Not ever again. Chapter 12. Catty stayed anchored to the spot, her joints and muscles refusing to move. When the door slammed behind Lucien, her gut hardened and twisted with painful regret. She'd been a bitch to him, a tease. She was trying to force his hand, get him to show his true colors. She knew he was hiding something he wasn't telling her. God knew she couldn't trust people's words, but she could trust their actions. She'd practically thrown herself at him, something she'd never done before. He'd turned her down, something no male had done before. Although it had been a test, he'd not been impressed with her one redeeming quality, her body. She wanted to go after him, to apologize, to explain herself and tell him she didn't normally act this way, but it was risky, especially now that he'd spilled the reason he was here, to help the Guardians. She placed a hand over her nauseated stomach. Too many troubles were coming at her at a speed she couldn't control. Zane was a Guardian and in trouble. He was her brother, and if she could help him out, then she would. If the wolves at the strip club caught wind of her hanging out with Lucien, who had ties to the Arkansas Guardians, there would be hell to pay. Louisiana. Werewolves hated Guardians. They didn't like anyone in their business, and Guardians had the power to keep them in line, especially Big Mike. If he found out she'd been trying to help the Guardians, her boss would want her blood. I have to help, even if it will cost me somewhere down the line. Barrett slowed his speed on his Harley-Davidson breakout as he approached the solitary driveway of the dusty rural road. He knew by the time he reached his destination the black denim finish on his bike was going to be covered in a film of dust. He'd ridden his bike like hell, was on his heels down the lonesome highway in the dead of night. He needed to get away from his pack, his obligations, and his helplessness. He needed to find some answers. The hot night air stuck to his t-shirt, making his flesh drip with sweat like drops of rain. He'd grown up in humidity and heat in his home state of South Carolina. He could handle whatever Arkansas threw his way. He slowed his bike as his headlight fell upon the 5-foot iron fence surrounding the isolated cemetery only a few knew about. He was meeting someone who might have some answers, or could at least point him in the right direction. Another package had come in that afternoon after all the Guardians had headed out for dinner. This time when he opened the small box, it was something more than a tattoo. It was Jaime's middle finger. Apparently the assholes had cut off one hand and now were cutting off the fingers of the other hand one by one. There was no way the werewolf would still be alive after all that. Barrett knew the captors were playing with him. making sure to let him know how much his guardian had suffered before he drew his last breath. Barrett had sworn to protect his werewolves, and he meant it. He'd failed Jaime, but he sure as hell wasn't going to fail anyone else. He killed the engine and slid off his bike. He made his way into the cemetery and looked around. He glanced at the time on his phone. He was early. He spotted a large headstone in the shape of a tree trunk and walked over. Sticking his hands in his pockets, he rested against the stone. Humans were weird, wanting the biggest headstone and showing off long after they were dead. Didn't they realize no one remembered you after you died? Not even if you put up the biggest monument of yourself. The only thing people remembered was what you did for them, good or bad. A few minutes later, soft footsteps had him turning his attention in their direction. I was beginning to wonder if you would show up. Barrett pushed off the headstone and met the gaze of Jack Wellborn, Packmaster of Mississippi. I always keep my promises, although your request for a meeting was on short notice. The large figure stepped into a stream of moonlight and smiled. Jack was dressed in a black business suit and loafers. That's no way to travel on a Harley, Jack. Barrett nodded at his clothing. There wasn't time to bring my Harley. Jack arched his thick brow. I had to take my private plane so I wouldn't be late for this meeting. You know it takes a few hours to travel from Mississippi. Did you land in Little Rock? Nah. I like to keep this under the radar. So I landed about a mile from here. Small landing strip through the woods. He nodded over his shoulder. I keep a map of all the airstrips throughout the southern states. Never know when you might need an emergency landing. Barrett knew the real reason. Jack wouldn't want to be seen with Barrett, especially since finding out what had been happening to his guardians might put his Mississippi guardians in danger. I'm in a tight spot, Jack. He rubbed his hand down his face and met the Packmaster's gaze. So I hear. The Mississippi Packmaster knit his brows together as he walked down the little deer path that wound its way from the cemetery into the thick woods. Barrett fell into step beside him. Jack Wellborn was 20 years older than Barrett. When Barrett had assumed the seat of Packmaster in Arkansas, Jack was also one of the ones to welcome him without having anything to say about his age. Jack was hard but fair, something Barrett strived to be with his own state. I have to say I've never heard of our guardians being hunted before. You've not had any guardians come up missing? Barrett cut his eyes at him. No. All of mine are accounted for. Concern etched into the granite of his tone and the hard expression on his face. Forgive me for asking, but have they all been accounted for while on their missions in Arkansas? He hated to ask, but he had to know. Jack halted in his steps. His gaze tightened on Barrett. Are you insinuating my werewolves have been hunting other guardians? His tone deepened. The older Packmaster might have some years on Barrett, but the old fucker was still a wall of muscle. Like I said, forgive me. Barrett looked away and ran his hands through his hair, his muscles twitching, needing to release this built-up hostility that was slowly poisoning his body. But I've got guardians missing in packages, arriving with their fucking extremities in them. His gut tightened in disgust. Jack nodded and relaxed. Your anger is understandable. If it were my men, I'd want someone's dick on a stick too. He shook his head. I've asked around as much as I can without giving away too much. No one in Mississippi has heard anything. Hell, I've even put more guardians around the state border to increase security. Fuck. Barrett curled his fingers in a fist and slammed it into the oak tree. The tree groaned and splintered, leaving the interior exposed. I know this is hard, but you've got to keep your head straight. Your dad wouldn't want you acting like this. My father is dead. It doesn't matter what he thinks of me anymore. Jack laid a gentle hand on his shoulder. Barrett. He shrugged him off. He didn't want to talk about his father. He had too many important issues to deal with to go down memory lane. Look, is there anyone in your state who might have a lead on what's going on with this? Jack frowned and looked away. You know someone. Some people shouldn't be relied upon for any kind of help, Barrett. Once you go asking, they're always going to want a favor. You don't want your soul indebted to the devil. He planted his feet in a wide stance and glared at him. The intensity was not lost on Barrett. What Jack didn't realize was that Barrett was willing to risk it all. If it means stopping whoever is hurting my guardians, I'll gladly sell body. and sold to the devil. Jack glanced at the ground and then back up. You might be singing a different tune after you meet that bitch. Wow, this place hasn't looked this good in. Who am I kidding, this place has never looked this good. Catty stuck the cleaning product back in the cabinet and glanced around her apartment, seeing whether she'd forgotten to clean something. Nervous energy still pulsed in her veins despite cleaning her apartment from end to end. Her muscles ached from scrubbing the floor, but her mind was as restless as a cat in a paper sack. She might pick up from time to time, but clean. She never cleaned. But today she'd needed something to take her mind off Lucien and the way he had looked at her before walking out the door. She sat down in front of the window, heart heavy and regret tugging at her gut. She looked down at the busy street. Night was falling across the city, lulling its victims into debauchery for a dime. When Lucien had mentioned Zane, shame had washed over her like a waterfall. Was her brother okay? And what trouble was he in? What trouble were the guardians in? Now she'd never know since Lucien had stormed out. What were you thinking, Catty? She laid her head against the window and screwed her eyes tight. No wonder her life was so messed up. She always acted without thinking, and then she had to face the consequences. Even as a stripper, she wasn't facing her consequences. She was hiding. She was tired of hiding. She wanted something more. She wanted some direction in her life, some purpose. Sighing, she stood and headed over to her laptop. She powered up her computer and sat down at her small desk. Making decisions on the spur of the moment wasn't working in her favor. She needed a plan with clear direction. It was one reason she'd left home. She didn't have a purpose or a plan there. She couldn't live up to her family's perfect image. She wasn't smart like Zane or cultured like her mom. She wasn't determined like her father. She'd felt like a wild child, a gypsy. People always asked her what she wanted to do when she grew up, and she honestly couldn't answer them. The only time she did answer was when Skylar asked her. Skylar had wanted to build things to help people. It seemed so noble and so unlike anything Catty had ever wanted. But when Skylar kept asking her, Catty blurted out she didn't care what she did as long as she was seen. Catty had held her breath, waiting for Skylar to judge and make fun of her. But Skylar never did. Catty stared at the search bar and typed in how to find your perfect job. She hit the enter key. She scrolled down the search list until she came to a test designed to tell her what job she would best be suited for. She grabbed a quick cup of tea and settled in to answer the questions. No matter what it turned out to be, she was going to follow it. From here on out, she was sticking to a plan for her life. Lucien bent his head under the spray of water. The hot water had long since turned cold, but he was reluctant to get out. He needed the icy chill to help get Catty out of his mind. Turning the water off, he grabbed a towel and rubbed it across his long dark hair before tossing it on the floor. He crawled into the middle of the bed and lay on his back, letting the cool air drift over his naked body. He'd called and given Barrett an update about Catty. He'd told him to stay on the girl to see if she'd trip up and reveal something. Lucien was no closer to finding anything out about the Guardians than he had been when he'd gotten there. He hadn't seen a trace of his brother either. After leaving Catty's apartment, he'd hit a few bars and asked some questions, but no one seemed to know the whereabouts of his brother. He didn't trust Catty, not after the stunt she'd pulled. If she did know who was behind taking the Guardians, she wasn't talking. She might be in deep and too afraid to say anything. If she discovered he was a Guardian, it could be his ass on the line. A quick rap at the door had his muscles tensing and him on his feet in seconds. He grabbed a clean pair of jeans and pulled them over his hips. He grabbed his .9mm off the dresser and eased to the door to look through the peephole. What do you want? He growled. I have an envelope for you, sir. The young man on the other side of the door had to be no more than 20. Small build, dark greasy hair, and judging by the stench of fear pouring out of him, most definitely human. He stuck his gun in the back of his jeans and opened the door. The guy took one look at Lucien and his eyes grew round and white. Well, Lucien held out his hand. The human blinked, seemed to remember why he was there, and shoved an envelope in Lucien's hand. You're dismissed, Lucien barked when the guy didn't move. The human almost tripped over himself as he ran down the hallway. Lucien shook his head and shut the door. He wasn't usually abrupt with people, but he wasn't shopping in the patient's department today. He sat on the edge of the bed and opened the envelope. He pulled out a piece of paper with a message scrawled in Barrett's familiar handwriting. I'm arranging a meeting for you with the witch. Be in Yazoo City, Mississippi, at midnight tomorrow night. Go to the city's cemetery to the witch's grave. She's got information regarding the missing guardians. Yazoo City? Growing up in Louisiana, he'd heard the name bandied about a few times, mostly to do with urban legends and such. Being an urban legend himself, he didn't really remember the stories about the witch. Now he wished he'd listened better. His stomach rumbled in the empty room, reminding him of the late hour. He grabbed his leather jacket off the back of the chair. His gaze settled across the slash in the leather. Ruined. He'd had to get another jacket as soon as he got finished with this mission. It was part of him, part of who he was now. He wasn't about to let anyone see his vulnerability. Chapter 13. Another mojito. Catty sighed and shoved her glass toward the bartender. She'd planned on staying in on her night off, but she was going stir-crazy, so she'd gone out, hoping drinking would distract her. She needed to relax. What's wrong, sweetheart? Someone break your heart? A man slid onto the barstool next to her and leaned in. He was in his late 30s, nicely dressed with blonde hair and blue eyes. If it hadn't been for the predatory smile on his human face, she would have thought him handsome. Not exactly. There were some who didn't believe she had a heart. There was a good chance one of those people was Lucien. Is he bothering you? Lucien's deep voice had her stomach turning to jello. As her heart climbed into her throat, she turned. He stood there wearing the leather jacket and a pissed-off expression. Nobody's bothering anyone. She bounced her foot against the rung of the stool and tried to keep her voice even, strong and calm. Her words sounded odd in her ears. Looking past her, Lucien grabbed her drink and dumped it out on the floor. Hey, why did you do that? Her mouth dropped and she crossed her arms. We were just having a conversation, buddy. The guy smirked and rested his elbows on the bar. He gave Catty another smile that made her skin crawl. Actually, we're not having a conversation and I'm not interested in starting one. Now wait a minute. You've got some nerve acting all high and mighty while dressing like some 2-cent hooker. The man stood. Her mouth dropped. Look, asshole. First you're going to apologize, Lucien growled at the guy. And then you're going to call your mom and tell her what you said and how much of a dick you were tonight. Let me tell you something. The man's deceptive smile slipped and revealed a snarl that made Catty cringe. I'm not finished. Lucien stepped into the man's personal space, their chests touching. The human might be big, but Lucien was bigger. You're never going to come into this bar again and harass another woman. And you're sure as hell not going to try to drug another woman. Drug? What you mean? She tried to stand to make her legs move, but the signal wasn't getting to her brain. Her body felt weightless, like she was floating on a white puffy cloud. I saw him slip something in your drink. Lucien's tone dripped with venom, the kind that could kill in seconds. I'm calling the cops. The bartender grabbed a phone behind the bar and punched in some numbers. I don't put up with that shit in my bar. No need. I am an undercover cop. Lucien answered. I'll take care of this. Catty frowned. Undercover cop. She hadn't pegged him for that. Fine, fine, the man stuttered, his face going pale. I'm sorry for what I said. I didn't mean any harm. I'll just go. You're not going anywhere. You still need to call your mother. Lucien held out his hand. Give me your phone. What? He rubbed his palms down his pants leg and jerked his gaze around the room. Your phone. Now, or I'm going to punch you in the throat. You can't talk to your mom when your throat is collapsed. The guy blinked and dug around in his trouser pocket. He fished out his phone and handed it to Lucien. Your password. What? What is your password? Big dick. An asshole and a liar. Lucien snorted. Catty squeezed her eyes tight, trying to clear her muddled head. Whatever he had put her drink must be strong. The bartender shoved a glass of water at her and told her to drink. She complied but kept her gaze locked on Lucien. His jet black hair fell across his forehead and scraped his shoulders as his breathing increased with each heavy breath. His lips were stretched across his white teeth in a sneer and his hands were fisted at his sides. He looked like he was ready to kill in his black leather jacket. The drugs must have affected her brain because she was starting to imagine herself naked and in his arms. He was hot for sure, but he had a calm, deadly demeanor like he could snap at the flip of a switch. He was the last guy she needed to be getting all hot and bothered about. Big Mike caught wind she was hanging out with a werewolf outside the club, then her life would be in danger. She watched the scene play out in a blur of activity. The guy put the phone up to his ear. The next few minutes consisted of him confessing to his mom what he'd done and trying to apologize. Lucien then took the phone out of the man's hand and began telling the guy's mom he would make sure he got the help he needed. He hung up and shoved the phone in the man's chest. You will leave and never harm another woman again. If you do, I will find out about it. I have eyes everywhere. You can't hide from me. Are we clear? The guy slipped a finger beneath his collar and tugged. Sweat popped up across his upper lip and forehead, and his chin quivered. He nodded several times before he backed away and finally fled out the front door. Are you all right? Lucien stepped between her legs and leaned in close, his warm breath tickling her cheeks. Her stomach tingled and she closed her eyes. His scent was washing over her like a tidal wave of sexy alpha male. Catty. The unmistakable tone of concern was stamped into his voice. She opened her eyes to find him staring intently at her. He cupped her face, his eyes scanning her face. Mentally she was telling him to leave, to step away and stop touching her, but she couldn't seem to make herself say the words. Lucien. His name rolled out of her mouth like a moan. Come on. He tugged her to her feet. Her legs buckled. He swept her up in his arms before she could fall. She wrapped her arms around him and tucked her face into the crook of his neck. Big mistake. Her stomach warmed, sending delicious tendrils of lust through her body. Ugh, she moaned. We're leaving, he whispered against her cheek, his voice deep and urgent. He hurried down the sidewalk, taking long strides as he put distance between them and the bar. She opened her eyes and looked over his shoulder. He was not headed toward her apartment. She should have questioned him, but right now she really didn't care where they were going. I'm taking you to my hotel. Are you a mind reader? She murmured against his neck, her lips scraping across his flesh. His hotel was the only place she wanted to be right now. If I were a mind reader, I wouldn't still be trying to get information out of you now, would I? He groused. Or maybe you'd realize I don't have any information. She let her head loll back against his shoulder. Maybe, he said softly. Or maybe you're just a tough nut to crack. Are you saying you want to crack me? She lifted her head and smiled. He stopped in his tracks, his heart beating rapidly against her body, and looked down at her. When he started walking, she laid her head back down and closed her eyes. You sure don't trust people, do ya? He adjusted his grip. I have too many reasons not to trust people. His fingers brushed the side of her breast. Pleasure shot through her body, straight to her core. Her breathing turned to a pant as she buried her face in his neck. She opened her eyes long enough to see plenty of women on the sidewalk openly eyeing Lucien. Apparently he either didn't notice or didn't care because he ignored them all. He stopped at the hotel and opened the door. He walked through the corridor and stepped into the empty elevator. Her heart tumbled in her chest. She wasn't sure what was going to happen once they stepped inside his room, but she certainly didn't want to give him the wrong idea about her for a second time. Lucien, I can walk. Not going to happen. Her heart heated and tumbled. The elevator dinged and he stepped off with his arms full of her. He stopped and unlocked the door. Once inside, he kicked the door shut with his boot. He carefully laid her on the bed and knelt in front of her. She blinked slowly and met his gaze. Are you having blurred vision? No, she held his gaze. Is your heart racing? Yes. He frowned. Are you having difficulty breathing? Yes. With him so close, how could she breathe easy? He pressed his hand to her forehead. You're burning up. You have no idea. She clutched at the comforter to keep from grabbing at him and ripping his clothes off. Lucien, stop. She pulled his hand from her head and pressed it to her chest. It's not because of the drug or whatever that asshole gave me that I feel this way. She'd only had a drink before Lucien interrupted them. Then what is it? It's Chapter 16. Lucien squinted as the blinding morning sun filtered through the lace curtains. He rolled over to his side and pulled Catty into his arms. We don't have time for another round. She laughed and she tried to wiggle away. There's always time for another round. He buried his face in the crook of her neck. His hand went between her legs and stopped. He frowned. Why are you already dressed? He inhaled her scent at her neck. And showered. Because it's almost 8 o'clock and I need coffee. She rolled over and kissed him on the mouth. Besides, you said something last night about some meeting today. I thought you needed to be up early. He sat up in bed and glanced at the clock on the bedside table. Shit. Relax, I'm sure you've got plenty of time. She tugged on her shoes and glanced over at him. I've got to be in Mississippi tonight. He grabbed his phone and pulled up his map and confirmed how long the trip would take on a Harley. He relaxed when he saw he had plenty of time to make it. Where in Mississippi? She grabbed the brush off her nightstand and ran it through her blonde hair. The silky blonde strands glistened like gold in the morning sun. He itched to reach out and run his fingers through her hair. The way it had felt against this chest as she slept was one of the most intimate moments he'd ever shared with a woman. Yazoo City. He put his feet on the floor and tugged her toward him. She froze. Please tell me you're not going there to see her. Her pupils dilated and her lips parted. Who? The witch. How did you know who I was going to see? An uneasy feeling crept up his spine. Because there's no reason for any werewolf to go to Yazoo City unless you're looking for trouble. She is nothing but trouble. She shook her head. Do you know her? Unfortunately. Her beautiful eyes narrowed into hardened slits and she pressed her lips into a thin white line. If I asked you not to go, would you listen to me? She shot him a glare. No, he couldn't help but grin. Sorry, baby, but I'm on a job here. She frowned. Am I part of the job? The job is the reason I came looking for you. But what's going on between us is not part of the job. He swallowed and pulled her into his arms. Guilt stung his gut like bees. He hadn't been totally honest with her. He hadn't told her what he was. He hated lying to her when she bared herself to him in so many ways. So how do you know her? He pulled into his lap. Keeping her hands to herself when it comes to someone else's boyfriend is not a skill she possesses. Jealousy spiraled down in his stomach. Boyfriend? How long ago was this? She snorted. It's been a few years. So you can stop looking at me like that. What happened? I saw her in a bar one night when I was out with my boyfriend. We were dancing and she kept trying to cut in. He kept turning her down. Didn't matter to her. He went to grab us some beers. When he didn't come back, I went looking for him. I found him banging her in the alley out back. He had this weird unfocused look in his eyes like he was seeing right through me. Didn't realize at the time, but she had cast a seduction spell on him. I'm sorry. He really wasn't. He was glad she wasn't still dating the douchebag. I think a guy who is weak enough to cheat doesn't need a spell. He probably would have done it eventually. Better that I found out when I did so I didn't waste any more time with him. She shrugged. Needless to say, the witch and I are not going to be BFFs anytime soon. She narrowed her eyes at him. And it's also why I'm coming with you. You don't trust me? He arched his eyebrow. His chest filled with warmth. Felt good to have someone feel protective over him, even if it was for the moment. I don't trust her. She stood and pulled out of his reach. She shoved her thumb in the direction of the bathroom. Now hurry up and shower. We're going to need to stop by my place so I can change into jeans and my biker boots. It had been a while since Catty had been on the back of a Harley. With the wind in her hair and her arms around Lucien's waist, she couldn't stop smiling. As they sped down the highway, it was an escape from reality she desperately craved. Doing okay? Lucien yelled over the wind and the roar of the engine. Never better. She smiled as she laid her head on his warm leather-clad shoulder and tightened her grip. She tried to convince him to take the heavy jacket off, but he insisted on wearing it. They rode for hours, only stopping a couple of times to get gas. He tried to get her to eat something, but the heat sapped her appetite. She was too eager to get back on the Harley and get to their destination. Would Lucien be drawn to the witch? Would she seduce him like she'd done so many men in the past? Or would Lucien be able to stand strong and resist her under his own power? She inhaled deeply and pushed away her negative thoughts. Lucien was different. He had to be. He'd been nothing but honest with her, and she'd seen how hard it had been for him. Whatever reason he was looking into the dirty dealings in New Orleans made her think he had been hired from within the Arkansas pack. Maybe he was running. Intel for the pack. Maybe it was personal. She wasn't sure. She was sure he wasn't a guardian. The guardians always had their back tatted up with their insignia. Guardians were lethal and were the peacekeepers among the civilian werewolf population. She couldn't imagine Zane being a guardian. They were the muscle for the packmaster, and her brother was always more of the brains kind of guy. But people change. She knew better than anyone. She wanted to change for the better. At least Lucien wasn't a guardian. If anyone at the club caught wind she was hanging with a guardian, then it would mean her life. She knew Lucien would never put her in danger. Lucien slowed his speed once he hit the city limits of Yazoo City, Mississippi. It was well after dark and the streets were illuminated by streetlights and headlights of traffic. He made a turn and continued down the steep hill that led into the heart of the city. Keeping his speed well under the limit, he continued his trek through the historic little town. Streets were lined with oak trees, Victorian homes, and sidewalks. For an outsider passing through, it looked enough like a normal small town. But he wasn't fooled. His senses went on high alert and he could feel some odd paranormal energy flowing through the town that seemed to get stronger the closer he got to his destination. It felt like a curse hanging over the small town. When he reached the entrance to the Glenwood Cemetery, he parked and killed the engine. Setting the kickstand, he slid off the bike and then lifted Catty off. I can do it myself. I know. I just like touching you. He held her close and gave her a quick kiss before taking a quick glance around. The gate is locked. He frowned. Yeah, I figured it would be. The witch's grave has been vandalized so many times that they started locking it at night. I googled it. She shrugged. Climb on my back and I'll scale the fence. I can climb, Lucien. I don't care. If you slip and fall on the fence, it will impale you. I'm not taking the chance. He pointed to his back. Get on. She sighed heavily and climbed on his back. His body immediately warmed when she pressed her lips against his neck. Just so you know, don't look her in the eyes. Why? Is she Medusa? The only thing she's interested in turning into stone is your dick. Just make sure it doesn't happen. The icy tone in her voice and the glare she shot him made him realize how much she hated the witch. He smiled. I like your jealousy. It's turning me on. As long as it's not her turning you on. She climbed on his back and wrapped her arms around his neck. He jumped, scaled the fence and landed on the other side. She slid off his back. Lucien took the opportunity to assess his surroundings. The cemetery was empty, and he could see there was no one else around, but the distinctive sound of 70s music drifted around them. What the hell is that god-awful sound? He flinched and looked around, trying to determine where the sound was coming from. Oh yeah, I forgot to tell you. Our witch prefers listening to ABBA. Catty cocked her head and stilled. Sounds like she's listening to Dancing Queen. Fuck me. This is going to be torture. He hated any music that wasn't rock. He especially hated 70s music. He took Catty's hand in his and led her farther into the rows and rows of graves and headstones. Some of the graves were illuminated by solar lights loved ones had placed near the headstones. Others had flowers, both artificial and real, sitting around the graves. Few security lights were within the cemetery, making some areas well lit and others surrounded by darkness. Catty looked up from her cell phone. According to my map, her grave is over there, not far from the fountain and near the funny-looking headstone. They found the identifying markers, and the closer they got the louder the music was. There was headstone broken and lying on the ground with large chains around. Some of the links in the chains were missing. I'm guessing the chains are supposed to keep her here, he said. Which is why they are broken. A sultry feminine voice came from a nearby tree. A woman dressed in a white sundress stepped out from the shadows. The nearby security light illuminated her flaming red hair which flowed in waves across her slender shoulders. Her eyes, a startling shade of electric green, held a hint of amusement as she studied them both with interest. She looked to be in her mid-20s, and she was a far cry from the image of an old hag Lucien had imagined. I was expecting you to be alone. She smiled as her gaze roamed down the length of his body and settled on his crotch. He shifted under the scrutiny of her vulgar stare. Hello, Ella, Catty said. I'm sorry. Do we know each other? The witch turned her attention to Catty and glared. Yeah, You fucked my boyfriend in the alley in New Orleans. Catty's dry tone held a deadly edge. That doesn't narrow it down at all, honey. Ella smiled sweetly. I'm not surprised. Catty snarled. Ella lunged for her. Catty let out a feral growl, ready for a fight. Lucien stepped in between the two women. I was told you have some information for me about some of the missing guardians. He glared at the witch. The smile dropped off her face. I think you heard wrong. The tone in her voice was too sure, too forced, too ready to change the subject. She snapped her fingers and the music changed to a different song by ABBA. Lucien closed the distance between him and the witch. Listen, don't waste my time. I'm here because I was told you could help me. She arched her perfectly plucked brow and gave a chuckle. I don't give information away for free. That's not how I play. She sat on a nearby headstone and spread her legs suggestively. I'm going to need something in return for the information you want. Catty growled. Really? Lucien reached inside the jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. Inside was $10,000 Barrett had sent along with the direction. He held it out to Ella. Money is something I don't need since I'm stuck inside this cemetery. She snorted and stepped up to him. Now if there is something else you want to bargain with, then I'll talk. She ran her finger down the front of his chest. He grabbed her hand and frowned. How are you in human form if you're supposed to be dead? Part of this damn curse. My body won't die and my soul is bound to my body. I'm cursed, stuck inside this cemetery. What good is money to me here? According to legend, you escaped and burned the city. Lucien didn't trust this bitch as far as he could throw her. Well, it was kind of a fluke, actually. She shrugged. I knew I had to make a blood exchange. I had to sacrifice someone so I could escape. The innocent blood lowers the curse, therefore making it possible for me to escape. The first time I escaped and set the town of Yazoo on fire for killing me. The second time, the time no one found out about, I made it all the way to New Orleans before being sucked back in this place. You have to kill a human? Catty glared. I prefer someone with supernatural blood. Human blood is weak and it only lets me out for a little while before the curse brings me back here. Catty propped her hands on her hips. Who did you kill to be able to make it to New Orleans? Ella's smile grew predatory. A werewolf. Like you. Lucien's body tightened and a wave of protectiveness buzzed through his body. He stepped in front of Catty, blocking the witch's view. But it doesn't release you forever. No, nothing does. I know when the blood exchange begins to lose its power. Get dizzy and faint. Her smile slipped off her face. When I open my eyes, I'm back in this shithole. She glared at her surroundings, her green eyes sparking with hatred. Catty's cell phone rang. The ringtone, set to a Miranda Lambert song, broke the silence of the graveyard. She dug it out of her jeans pocket, looked at the screen and then shoved it back in her pocket. What was that? Ella craned her neck around Lucien, her eyes wide. It's a cell phone. Catty snorted. I know it's a cell phone, dummy. I meant the music. Her eyes glazed over. Country music. Haven't you ever heard her before? He wasn't a fan, but it would be an improvement from the heinous 70s stuff she was making them listen to. I tell you what, I want that music. Her eyes lit up. I'll take it in exchange for information you want. He relented. Fine. I'll buy you a CD. No. I want it now. She held out her hand to Catty. Hand me your phone. Catty frowned and met Lucien's gaze. He nodded. Reluctantly, Catty handed her phone over. Ella held the phone in the palm of her hand and closed her eyes. She spoke a few words in a language he didn't recognize and the phone began to levitate. Music drifted from the phone like wisps of pink smoke. Ella opened her mouth, letting the pink swirls and music into her mouth. When the last note left the phone, she closed her mouth and swallowed. The phone drifted down into her palm. She held out the phone to Catty, who stared at it like it was a coiled snake. Whatever music you downloaded to your phone is gone. Ella's sing-song tone grated on Lucien's nerves. If it grated his nerves, it had to be cutting. Catty's last one. Catty snatched her phone and tucked it in her pocket. It's your turn. Tell me who is taking the guardians. Which other states have missing guardians? Lucien clenched his fists. He was done playing games with this witch and demanded answers. Gone was the flirty curve of her mouth and the twinkle in her stare. Her gaze was empty and soulless like a dead man's. She had funeral eyes. Her eyes glazed over as she stared straight ahead, focusing on some unseen picture. Lucien, the only guardians missing are the ones from Arkansas. If the other states know what's going on, they won't dare get their hands dirty by saying anything. The Packmaster of Mississippi took a chance by even sending you to me. He knows nothing of the plan. What plan? He stepped forward. His gut twisted as impending doom pressed down on the back of his neck. The plan to wipe out all the guardians. Arkansas is the beginning. With no guardians in place, all hell will be loosened upon this earth. Who is behind this? He grabbed her arm and tightened his hold. She blinked her eyes back into focus. She frowned and snatched her arms out of his hold. I can't see. All I know is you have to stop it. If any more guardians get tortured and killed, then the other states won't have your back. They want Arkansas out of the way. They know to break Arkansas they need to break the guardians. What do you mean? His heart thudded in his chest. This went further than he ever imagined. To break Arkansas, they know they have to eliminate your Packmaster Barrett Middleton.